All right, so we're diving into Rework today.
Yes, we are.
This business book, it's really shaking things up.
It really is.
And we're going beyond just a typical book report here.
Definitely.
We've got excerpts from Rework that you've shared, and we're going to unpack those counterintuitive ideas and see what gems we can find to rethink how work gets done.
Absolutely. And one of the things that fascinates me about Rework is that it doesn't just offer advice. It really kind of takes a sledgehammer to traditional business thinking.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah, unpack that a little. What do you mean by that?
Well, they argue that the real world of business that we always hear about
Right.
is actually steeped in pessimism.
Yeah.
And they think that this negativity is a major roadblock to innovation.
So to be truly innovative, you need to break free from that.
Exactly.
That pessimistic mindset.
Exactly. And they're not just armchair quarterbacks, you know?
Yeah.
They use their own company, 37 Signals, as like a living, breathing example of this philosophy in action. And they've deliberately structured their company to defy those so-called real-world limitations.
Yeah.
You know, like meeting a massive staff or a fancy office.
Right.
And get this, they've thrived doing it.
Okay, so they're saying we should just throw all the traditional rules out the window.
Not necessarily. It's more about focusing on what actually works.
Yeah.
Rather than blindly following rules that might be outdated.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah.
So, for example, they debunk the myth that you need a super detailed long-term business plan to succeed.
That's interesting. I've always been told a business plan is like the holy grail of starting a business. Why do they push back against that?
Well, their argument is that spending months crafting a detailed business plan is often a waste of time, especially in those early stages.
Yeah.
The business landscape changes so rapidly.
Right.
And clinging to a rigid plan can actually make you less adaptable and less responsive.
So it's more about being agile and responsive to change.
Exactly.
And sticking to the plan.
Exactly. And they also challenged another big one, the myth of constant growth.
Yeah, the whole always be scaling, always be growing.
Right.
What's their alternative?
They advocate for sustainable growth.
Yeah.
You know, the kind that doesn't burn you out or compromise your values.
Right.
They argue that chasing fleeting startup glory can be detrimental in the long run.
Yeah.
Instead, they encourage building a business that's built to last.
Okay.
Not just a flip.
So quality over quantity when it comes to growth.
Absolutely a great way to put it. And this whole work smarter, not harder philosophy really seems to be a theme throughout the book.
They go after workaholism.
They do.
I mean, it's almost refreshing to hear somebody pushing back against that whole hustle culture.
It is refreshing.
Yeah.
Grind mentality.
They advocate for reasonable working hours, prioritizing productivity hacks, and actively avoiding burnout.
They see workaholism as a problem, not a badge of honor.
Right.
You know?
It's a healthier approach for sure.
Absolutely.
And their take on meetings is pretty radical too.
It is.
I think they even call them toxic at one point.
They do.
And they have some practical advice, I think, on how to minimize those interruptions that can just throw your day off.
Absolutely. And I think we can all relate to that feeling.
Oh, yeah.
Of constantly being pulled in a million directions.
Yeah, a million different directions.
But what I find particularly insightful is their emphasis on the power of constraints.
Okay.
They actually encourage embracing limitations.
Really?
And argue that they can actually spark creativity.
That seems counterintuitive. How do limitations boost creativity?
Well, they argue that constraints force you to think outside the box.
Okay.
To be more resourceful and innovative. And they use the example of Shakespeare's sonnets.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't think strict rules about rhyme and meter would lead to some of the most beautiful poetry.
Exactly.
Ever.
And it's not just art.
Okay.
They even give the example of Southwest Airlines.
Okay.
Which famously only uses one type of plane.
Right.
Which might seem limiting, but it simplifies their operations.
Okay.
Lowers costs and ultimately makes them more efficient.
So by working within constraints,
yeah,
you're forced to be more creative and resourceful.
Precisely. And this ties into their whole philosophy of launching your work as soon as possible, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah.
You know, they're big believers in getting real feedback from the market early on.
So it's kind of like a chef sharing recipes.
Yeah.
The more you share your work, the more feedback you get.
Exactly.
The better you become.
That's a great analogy. Yes. And when it comes to promotion, they encourage building an audience by sharing your knowledge freely.
Okay.
They see that as more effective and authentic way to promote your work than traditional marketing tactics.
Interesting.
Yeah. And their advice on hiring is equally unconventional. Forget resumes, they say. Focus on skills and attitude.
Yeah, they seem to be all about finding those managers of one, right?
Right, people who are self-directed, take ownership, and don't need constant hand-holding.
What does that actually look like in practice? How can you tell if someone's a manager of one?
Well, they highlight traits like initiative, resourcefulness, problem-solving skills, and a strong sense of responsibility. Think of someone who anticipates needs, finds solutions proactively, and doesn't wait for instructions. Someone who thrives on autonomy and takes pride in owning their work from start to finish.
That makes sense. And that aligns with their advocacy for remote work too, right?
Absolutely. Rework champions remote work as a viable and in many ways superior way to structure a company.
Yeah.
Considering the rise of remote work today, their insights on making it work are more relevant than ever.
Yeah, I was also struck by their perspective on damage control. It's not just about putting out fires, but how you handle those situations can actually define your company's image.
They have this really interesting take on owning bad news and apologizing effectively. Speed and sincerity are key, they say.
But isn't there a risk in apologizing too quickly? Could that be seen as an admission of guilt?
They acknowledge that risk, but argue that a swift, sincere apology demonstrates transparency and a willingness to take responsibility, which ultimately builds trust with your audience.
So it's about taking control of the narrative before someone else does.
Exactly. They use the example of the Exxon Valdez oil spill to illustrate how a company's response to a crisis can either make things worse or turn things around.
That's a powerful example. So it's not just about saying sorry, but taking concrete actions to make things right.
Absolutely. Empty words won't cut it. They emphasize the importance of showing genuine remorse and outlining specific steps to rectify the situation.
Okay, so we've talked about challenging traditional norms and building a strong team. But what about the financial side of things? How do they approach funding a business?
This is where it gets really interesting. They actually push back against the idea of seeking outside investment as a first resort.
Really? But isn't funding crucial, especially for startups?
They argue that taking on outside investment, especially early on, can actually lead to a loss of control and pressure to make decisions that aren't in the best long-term interests of your business. They even call outside money Plan Z, encouraging entrepreneurs to bootstrap as long as they possibly can.
So it's about maintaining control and staying true to your vision.
Precisely. They argue that relying on outside funding can create a false sense of security, delaying the moment when your business needs to become truly sustainable.
So it's about building a business that can stand on its own 2 feet, not one that's dependent on someone else's money.
That's the idea. And this ties into their whole philosophy of building a lean, efficient operation. They stress the importance of starting small, keeping your overhead low, and avoiding unnecessary expenses. You need less than you think, they say.
Less than you think of what exactly?
Just about everything. Staff, office space, equipment, even time. They encourage doing things yourself in the beginning, getting your hands dirty, understanding every aspect of your business. Only hire when the pain of not hiring becomes unbearable.
So it's about being resourceful and finding creative solutions. And what about the product itself? How do they approach product development?
When it comes to building a product, they emphasize focusing on the core, the essential elements. They have this concept they call finding the epicenter.
Epicenter. What exactly do they mean by that?
It's about identifying the heart of your product. What's the one thing that absolutely cannot be removed without fundamentally changing what you're selling? Focus on that first.
So it's about finding the essence of your product and building from there.
Exactly. And they caution against getting bogged down in details too early in the process.
Why is that?
They argue that obsessing over minor details can lead to delays, disagreements, and loss of momentum. Get the big things right first, they say, then refine the details later.
So don't sweat the small stuff, at least not in the beginning.
Right. And this philosophy extends to their approach to decision-making, too.
How so?
They encourage making decisions quickly, even if they're not perfect. They believe that making a decision, even a wrong one, is better than delaying and getting stuck in analysis paralysis.
That's interesting. But isn't there a risk in making hasty decisions?
They acknowledge that, but argue that a quick decision, even if it needs adjusting later, is better than no decision at all. They have this great phrase, making the call is making progress.
So it's about being decisive and not letting fear hold you back.
Exactly. It's about being willing to take risks, to move forward and adjust course if necessary.
Okay, so be decisive, focus on the core, don't get bogged down in details. Anything else?
They also stress the importance of being a curator when it comes to your product. Be ruthless in editing, cutting features, and simplifying.
Less is more.
Absolutely. It's about being deliberate about what you include and, just as importantly, what you leave out. They believe that constraints can actually be liberating. By limiting your options, you force yourself to be more creative, more resourceful.
That's a fascinating perspective. I've always thought of constraints as limitations, but maybe they can actually be a source of strength.
That's exactly what Rework is trying to get at. And they make a strong case for focusing on what won't change. What are the core values, the essential elements that will always be relevant regardless of trends or technology? Build your business around those timeless principles.
So it's about building something that endures, not chasing the latest fads.
Precisely.
I also loved their point about tone is in your fingers, that it's not about the tools you use, but the skill and passion you bring to your work.
Yes. It's about the heart you put into it, the unique perspective and talent you bring to the table. That applies to any field, not just music.
Writing, designing, coding, cooking, anything. It's about the dedication and craftsmanship you pour into your work.
Exactly.
And they have that interesting idea about selling byproducts.
Yes. It's about recognizing that even the things you might consider waste or secondary can have value. They use the example of their own book, Getting Real, which started as a collection of blog posts and evolved into a successful product.
So it's about being observant, being creative, and looking for opportunities to leverage what you already have. Don't dismiss anything before exploring its potential.
Right. And when it comes to launching a product, they have a very clear message. Launch now.
Launch now,
Right.
even if it's not perfect.
Exactly. Don't wait for perfection. Don't get bogged down in endless tinkering. They're all about getting your product out there, getting real feedback from real customers, and iterating based on that feedback.
But isn't there a risk in launching too early?
They actually suggest launching before you're fully ready. They call it building half a product, not a half-assed product.
That's a subtle but important distinction. What exactly do they mean by that?
They mean focus on the core functionality, the essential elements that deliver value to the user, and get that out the door. Don't get distracted by bells and whistles. You can always add those later based on user feedback.
So it's about prioritizing the essential over the extra.
Exactly. They emphasize the importance of speed and agility. Long development cycles can kill momentum and morale.
So it's better to have something out there that's functional and gathering feedback than to have a perfect product that never sees the light of day.
That's their philosophy in a nutshell.
Yeah.
They argue that real-world feedback is invaluable and can't be replicated in a development vacuum.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it sounds like they're really emphasizing getting out of your own head and just into the real world as fast as possible.
Absolutely. And another point they make that I find really compelling is that long, drawn-out projects, they can really drag a team down, but short, focused bursts of work with tangible results, those are much more motivating.
So it's like breaking a marathon down into a series of sprints.
That's a great way to put it.
You get that sense of accomplishment more frequently, which kind of keeps the momentum going.
And speaking of momentum, they have some really insightful advice on productivity.
Okay.
And they identify interruption as like the biggest productivity killer.
That makes sense. I mean, it feels like we're constantly bombarded with notifications and distractions these days. How do they suggest we combat that?
They recommend creating what they call an alone zone.
An alone zone? What's that?
It's about carving out dedicated time for focused, uninterrupted work.
Okay.
No emails, no phone calls, no meetings.
Right.
Just you and your most important tasks.
So like a mental sanctuary where you can truly focus.
Exactly. And they're also very critical of meetings, calling them toxic in many cases.
I think a lot of people would agree with that. Meetings can be such time suckers.
Right?
And often they're not very productive.
Yeah, what's their alternative?
Yeah, what's the alternative?
They suggest keeping meetings short-focused and only inviting the absolutely essential people.
Okay.
And if you can avoid a meeting altogether, even better.
Right.
They're big proponents of asynchronous communication whenever possible.
So use meetings strategically, not as a default.
Exactly.
For every discussion.
Right. Another interesting point they make is that good enough is fine.
Okay, I think I need to hear more about this one.
Yeah.
Isn't the goal to strive for excellence?
It is, but they caution against letting perfectionism paralyze you.
Okay.
Sometimes getting something out the door that's good enough is better than waiting for perfection.
Okay.
Which might never come.
So finding that balance between striving for quality but not getting stuck in that endless cycle of refinement.
Exactly. They argue that you could always iterate, refine, and improve later.
Right.
based on real-world feedback.
So it's launch now, perfect later, but
Right.
applied to like individual tasks?
Exactly. And speaking of feedback,
Yeah.
they also highlight the importance of quick wins.
Okay.
Small victories, even seemingly insignificant ones,
Yeah.
can really boost morale and keep a team motivated.
So don't get bogged down in those long, drawn-out projects.
Right.
Find ways to achieve those quick, tangible results and celebrate those wins along the way.
Exactly. And what happens when things aren't going as planned?
Yeah, what about that?
Well, they have some interesting advice for that, too.
Okay.
They actually encourage quitting in some cases.
Quitting!
Yeah.
That seems a bit extreme. Isn't persistence a key to success?
Persistence is important, but they argue that it's equally important to recognize when a project or an idea just isn't working.
Right.
Don't throw good money after bad. Sometimes it's better to cut your losses and move on to something more promising.
So be strategic with your time and energy,
Right.
recognizing when to hold on and when to let go.
Exactly. And they also emphasize the importance of something that often gets overlooked
Yeah.
in our always-on culture.
Okay.
Sleep.
Sleep, yeah.
They see sleep deprivation as a major obstacle to creativity, morale,
Right.
and productivity.
It's about taking care of yourself, recognizing
Yeah.
that you're not a machine.
You're not a machine.
Yes.
Recharge, come back refreshed.
So rework is not just about rethinking how we work, but how we live.
Absolutely.
Ah.
And finally, they have a really interesting take on estimating. They argue that we're all terrible at it,
Okay.
especially when it comes to long-term projects.
That's probably true. I know I'm always overly optimistic about how long things are going to take.
Right.
What do they suggest?
They suggest breaking big projects down
Okay.
into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Right.
Which makes those estimates more accurate.
So be realistic and, recognize that unexpected delays
Right.
are inevitable.
Exactly. And when it comes to prioritizing all those tasks,
Yeah, how do we do that?
they have a simple but effective tip.
Okay.
Don't get bogged down in numbering or labeling tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Just put the most important thing at the top of your list
Okay.
and work your way down.
Keep it simple. Keep it visual.
Exactly.
Any final thoughts on rework before we wrap up?
I think one of the most powerful takeaways from Rework is that culture isn't something you create. It's something that emerges organically.
Okay.
It's a byproduct of consistent behavior, the values you embody,
Right.
the way you treat each other and your customers.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And they caution against premature scaling.
Okay.
Don't try to be a big company before you're actually a big company.
Right.
Focus on what works now. Stay nimble and adapt as you grow.
So rework, more than just a business book.
Yeah.
It's a philosophy, a way of thinking,
Mm-hmm.
a challenge to the status quo.
It's about being deliberate,
Mm-hmm.
resourceful, and true to yourself and your vision.
Building a business and a life that's not just successful,
Yeah.
but meaningful.
And for you, the listener, the question remains.
Yeah.
What will you rework? How will you apply these unconventional ideas to your own work, your own life?
That's the real deep dive.
That's the real deep dive.